Good day. Today is Friday, 1st November, and in the first part of my this video today, I'm going to discuss the situation in the Middle East. The first thing to say is that over the last couple of hours, there's been a number of statements by senior Iranian officials which appear to suggest that Iran is preparing for a major strike against Israel. In response to the strike that Israel launched against Iran on the 26th of October. And perhaps the most forthright statements have been made by the commander of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, General Salami. And he's reported to have made these comments. I'm taking this again from Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency. Addressing a cultural event in Iran's southern province of Fars on Thursday, Major Hossein Salami pointed to Israel's attack on Iran on October 26th, saying the Israelis were mistaken to think that they could change history by launching a number of missiles. He then reminded Israel of the retaliatory trust Promise 2 operation that Iran carried out on October 1st. That, of course, refers to Iran's missile strike on Israel, which took place on October 1st. And then Salami is then further quoted as saying that the Israelis have not forgotten how the Iranian missiles streaked across the sky, whilst the Israeli air defense systems failed to counteract. The Tasnim report then goes on to say that General Salami then warned Israel that it will be given an unimaginable response for its act of aggression against Iran. On October 1st, Iran responded to the Israeli assassination of Hamas political bureau chief Ismail Haniyeh, Hezbollah Secretary General Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, and Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps General Abbas Nilforoshan, by launching as many as 200 ballistic missiles towards Israel's military and intelligence bases all over the Palestinian territories. And in the early hours of October 26th, Israel attacked a number of military strikes in Iran, which resulted in the death of 4 Iranian servicemen and a civilian. So there we have it. We have General Salami, the head of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the man who is, in other words, in overall charge of Iran's missile forces. He's come forward and he has said that Israel will be given an unimaginable response for its act of aggression against Iran. So that appears to promise some kind of retaliation by Iran against Israel. And his comments were then backed by comments made by Iran's defense minister. And again, I'm taking all of this, the next series of reports of his statements from the semi-official Tasnim news agency. Iranian Defense Minister Brigadier General Aziz Nazirzadeh rejected media reports that Israeli warplanes violated Iran's airspace during a recent military attack. I'm going to return to that topic in a moment. Speaking to reporters on the sidelines of a cabinet meeting on Wednesday, so that tells us that there was a meeting of the Iranian government on Wednesday and that General Nazirzadeh and presumably General Salami of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps were in attendance. Anyway, speaking to reporters on the sidelines of a cabinet meeting on Wednesday, General Nazirzadeh denied rumours that Israeli fighter jets entered Iranian airspace on October 26th. According to the UN Charter, whenever the airspace of a country is violated, that country is entitled to respond to the violation and act of aggression, the defense minister added. And then we're further told that General Nazirzadeh dismissed reports claiming that a military site in Iran's northern city of Sharud had been damaged in the Israeli strike in an operation allegedly carried out from Iran's northern borders. Those are the claims that there were drone attacks on locations in northern Iran, drone attacks which had presumably been launched from the territory of Azerbaijan. I discussed those reports in a recent program I did about the Israeli strike. General Nazirzadeh denies that such an attack took place. He then goes on to say, and this is all from Tasnim, that the enemy tried to damage Iran's offense and defense systems, but could not inflict serious harm, as Iran has made civil defense arrangements in advance. One of Iran's air defense systems was replaced the day after the Israeli attack. There's been no disruption to the process of production of our offense systems, such as missiles. He appears to be saying that the Israeli attack did damage one air defense complex. Presumably that's the Hawk air defense complex, of which we have satellite information. But in all other respects, no damage of any significance was done. He then went on to say Iran would respond to even a single bullet being shot at its deserts, let alone the latest Israeli attack. We deem it unforgivable, and there will be a response to it, he warned. And that's the two leading military officials of the Iranian armed forces. They both appear to be, through these comments, speaking about a potential Iranian strike against Israel. Should we take this seriously? Quite possibly. There are concerns about this apparently across the Middle East. There was hopes that after the Israeli strike on Iran, the Iranians would follow through with some early reports that they were not intent on escalating the situation further and would not launch themselves a further attack on Israel. But instead, we see these two Iranian generals, the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the defense minister, and they're both coming and they appear to be talking about a further missile strike against Israel, with the defense minister pointedly reminding everybody of the events of the 1st of October and how the skies, the night sky over Israel was filled with Iranian missiles. So we'll see what happens, but it does look as if the Iranians are determined to push back. And as I said, these discussions appear to have happened, these comments appear to have happened, or at least we're told they happened, after a meeting of Iran's cabinet, which took place on Wednesday. And it looks as if both of these generals attended that cabinet meeting, and it looks as if they both come out of the cabinet meeting promising retaliation, and it looks as if a decision to launch this retaliation was probably made at that cabinet meeting. Or at least that is what the Iranians want us all to think. Now, it could be that the Iranians are again doing what they have done before, playing an elaborate game of psychological warfare against the Israelis, and by the way, the Americans as well, making them uncertain about what exactly it is that Iran is going to do. After all, it took months after the Israeli assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, before the Iranians did finally launch a missile strike on on Israel, even though they had given everyone to think in the immediate aftermath of that assassination that such a missile strike would soon be coming. But anyway, we'll just have to wait and see what exactly it is that the Iranians want to do. If they follow the pattern that they acted upon before, then it may be that months will pass before they do something, and it may be that nothing eventually will happen. But these are the Iranian comments, the Iranian statements, and I am sure that in Washington and Jerusalem, they're going to be taken very seriously. People are going to be very nervous about these latest developments. In the meantime, Hezbollah in Lebanon now has a new Secretary General. The previous Secretary General, Hassan Nasrallah, was assassinated some weeks ago. Then his successor, who was also, I believe, his brother-in-law, Safieddin, he was also assassinated in another Iranian missile strike, and Israeli missile strike. And now his further successor has been announced, and the person in question is Naim Qassem, who is not related to Nasrallah, and who, by the way, has been Hezbollah's second number two for a very, very long time, going all the way back to the 1980s. In fact, he was Hezbollah's deputy secretary general even before Nasrallah's own election or appointment to the post of Hezbollah's secretary general. So he is very much a veteran of Hezbollah's leadership. He's been part of that leadership for a very long time. Now, I had never heard, I'm going to say this straightforwardly, of Nasrallah's immediate successor, Safieddin, who was, as I said, killed shortly after in another Israeli strike. But, as it happens, I have heard of Naim Qassem. He has been actually quite an active official within Hezbollah. He's been a public figure for quite a long time. He's certainly made public speeches and he's given interviews, and he seems to have had quite a lot of the threads in his hands. In fact, I know that there were some who thought that he would have been a more obvious successor to Nasrallah after Nasrallah was assassinated than Safieddin was. So I want to say straight away that I'm not going to probe into Hezbollah's internal politics and its structures. Now, Qassem is clearly, based on his background, a tough and clever man, and I have no doubt that he would be a pretty effective leader of Hezbollah. Having said that, it is likely, following on the recent pattern, that the Israelis will be coming after him. One would assume that after the rapid succession of assassinations of Nasrallah and Safieddin, this time Hezbollah would be more careful in making sure that Qassem is kept out of harm's way. But anyway, we will have to see. Certainly, as I said, he's a tough and clever man, and I would not be surprised, based on what I have seen of him in the past, if he does actually prove somebody who can stabilize Hezbollah. Not that for the moment it seems to have needed a great deal of stabilizing. But anyway, I can imagine him as somebody who could lead Hezbollah quite effectively. Just saying. Anyway, these are statements from Iran. These are new changes that have taken place within Hezbollah. Hezbollah continues to fight. By the way, I understand that the last week, the final week of October, was the week that the Israeli Defense Forces suffered their heaviest admitted death toll in the wars in Gaza and Lebanon. Apparently around 62 Israeli soldiers were killed over the course of that week, which I would consider, by the way, for a small country, to be a high casualty rate. You know, we mustn't overlook the fact that Israel is a country of 9 million people. It can't absorb losses in quite the same way as, say, Russia or Ukraine, countries with populations of tens or hundreds of millions of people can do. But anyway, the fighting, nonetheless, in South Lebanon and in Gaza continues unabated. There's been more bombing by Israel, certainly of Beirut. I believe there's been some bombing of Gaza. I'm not going to pretend that I'm up to date with all of the patterns of the fighting which have taken place. But we are now getting some potentially quite important news. Now, in various programs, stretching back, extending back to August, I have spoken about the fact that the Russians, at some level, seem to have entered the game in the Middle East, and that the shadow of Moscow has fallen. We've had reports of the Russian Security Council Secretary, Sergei Shoigu, visiting Tehran on repeated occasions. We have confirmation that Iran and Russia are about to agree a formal treaty with each other, a strategic partnership document, the text of which has been agreed and which is now about to be presented to the Duma, the Russian parliament, for ratification. We've had two successive meetings between Putin and the Iranian President Pezeshkian. Putin has met Pezeshkian, firstly at a summit meeting in Ashgabat. This was a meeting at which various Central Asian leaders attended. Pezeshkian turned up and Putin met him there. This happened a week before the BRICS summit meeting. And of course, Pezeshkian, as the president of Iran, which is now a BRICS state, was also in attendance in Kazan. And Putin met him again for a second time. And incidentally, and for the record, there have also been reports that Pezeshkian has formally invited Putin to visit Iran, though apparently no date for that visit has yet been agreed. So there's been a lot of activity by the Russians and the Iranians with each other. But as I've also pointed out, there have been significant contacts between Israel and Russia as well. Some weeks ago, an Israeli delegation visited Moscow, supposedly seeking Russian help to get Israeli hostages in Gaza released. And then about a week ago, reports appeared in the Russian and Israeli media about the presence of a significant Russian delegation in Israel. We've had almost no information about these two respective visits. I've not heard, for example, that any of the important Russian officials, Putin and Lavrov, in other words, met with that Israeli delegation whilst it was in Moscow. And I've not heard that Prime Minister Netanyahu and other Israeli officials, Foreign Minister Katz and Defense Minister Gallant, have also had meetings with the Russians. But it does seem as if some sort of contacts between the Russians and the Israelis have been taking place. And as I said in many previous programs, stretching back many years, and I've also written extensively on this topic, Israel and Russia, since the end of the Cold War, and since the resumption, especially of diplomatic relations between them during the Gorbachev era, have actually maintained a continuous dialogue with each other. They haven't always been in agreement with each other about policy, about the situation in the Middle East, but they have worked with each other quite successfully on several occasions, especially in the early years of the Russian intervention in Syria, when Putin and Netanyahu had, as I well remember, a long meeting with each other in Moscow, in which they agreed a deconfliction line between their forces, their respective forces, which were both busy in Syria. The Russians defending the Assad government, the Israelis attacking Iranian installations in Syria, and sometimes attacking military units of the Assad government. Anyway, the Russians and the Israelis met then. And as I've often pointed out, the Russians actually, over the course of that meeting, as became very clear, both from Russian media reports at that time and from subsequent events, set out certain red lines which they required the Israelis to follow. The Russians made it clear at that time that they were not intervening in connection with the larger Arab-Israeli conflict. They were not intervening on Syria's behalf to defend Syria from Israel. They were there to help the Syrian government deal with its internal enemies, the various jihadi movements, and that the Russians were not looking for a fight with the Israelis. And the Russians made it clear that so long as the Israelis confined any attacks that they launched in Syria against Iranian targets or against Hezbollah targets, Hezbollah was also involved in the war, or even Syrian facilities, the Russians would not object. However, the Russians would object, and would object very strongly, if the Israelis attacked Russian installations, killed Russian personnel, or attacked the Syrian army whilst it was conducting military operations against the Syrian government's jihadi enemies, or if the Israelis took steps which might cause the entire viability of the Syrian government to come into question. At that point, the Russians would react, and they would react strongly. And that was the agreement. The Israelis accepted those red lines, and that was the agreement that the two sides came to. And by and large, with some important exceptions, with certain very difficult incidents, the Israelis did, on one occasion, shoot down a Russian reconnaissance aircraft, or rather, they didn't shoot it down, actually, as I now remember. They used a Russian reconnaissance aircraft to provide their fighter jets with cover from its Syrian ground radars, which caused the Russian reconnaissance aircraft to be shot down by Syrian air defenses. The Russians were absolutely furious about that event, and there were very, very strong protests made by the Russians to Israel, as I remember. Anyway, by and large and overall, this rather difficult agreement between Israel and Russia has held. And of course, there have been other incidents suggesting, at least, if not exactly a friendship between Israel and Russia, at least a dialogue between the two. Putin visited Israel, as I very well remember. He actually visited the Wailing Wall, as I also remember. I appreciate Israelis don't refer to it, like to have it referred to by that name, but I can't remember what the official name for it is, and apologies to everybody if I've mislabeled it, but most people will know what I'm referring to. Anyway, Putin visited it, and of course Netanyahu himself was once invited to Moscow and attended a Victory Day parade in Red Square, and this attracted an awful lot of attention, as I remember, and I wrote about it extensively. Suffice to say, Netanyahu came and accepted the invitation to the Victory Day parade in Moscow on the 9th of May, at a time when Western governments, because of the Ukraine conflict, this is before the start of the special military operation, but after the wider Ukraine conflict began in 2014, at a time when, because of the Ukraine conflict, Western officials were boycotting that event. So it also caused, as I remember, some tension between Israel and the West. And then, of course, at the start of the special military operation, the Israelis, through the person of former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, sought to mediate between Ukraine and Russia. Part of the mediation exercise that eventually led to the draft Istanbul Agreement of April 2022, which was never realized, but that's another story. And again, despite many expectations and much rumor, the Israelis also refused to provide military equipment to Ukraine in order to fight Russia. So we can see that there has been significant contact and dialogue between these two countries. They often disagree. They disagree fundamentally on the question of the setting up of a Palestinian state, but there is a large community in Israel of Jewish people who have emigrated there from Russia and who have, in many respects, preserved a lot of their Russian heritage. And the Russians, for their part, very mindful of the problems, the massive problems, previous periods of hostility to Israel caused them. Problems which, by the way, were also domestic as well as external, have made it their policy to maintain a dialogue with Israel no matter what. So contacts between Russia and Israel are not new. Now, all of that is interesting. You see that the Russians have strong contacts with Iran and they have contacts with Israel. They also have contacts with Hamas. Hamas has been regularly hosted in Moscow. The Russians have never turned their backs on Hamas in the way that the Western countries have done. There was even a Hamas delegation in Moscow, as I remember, some weeks ago. And the Russians have also long had pretty intense dialogue with Hezbollah and with the Lebanese government as well, incidentally. And of course, the Russians and Hezbollah fought alongside each other during the Syrian war in support of President Assad's government. So the Russians have all of these contacts. But there is another factor which I suspect is also at play, and that is that this dialogue between Moscow and Tehran, which almost certainly does have a security dimension. I discussed the other day rumors that the Russians had provided advanced radars to Iran and that these had been used by the Iranians to track Israeli fighter jets, including stealth fighter jets, just saying. Anyway, those rumors exist. There are also rumors that the Russians provided some of the targeting data and satellite information, which was a key factor in making the Iranian missile strike on Israel on the 1st of October so effective. Anyway, if all of these contacts, if all of this security dimension, the security assistance that Russia is providing Iran really is for real, then one can see how it might be providing the Russians with leverage over not just Iran, but Israel as well. Because through Russian help, the Iranians are in a position to launch effective strikes against Israel. So, this, by the way, just to quickly add, is very, very typical, if you know your Cold War history, of how the Russians frequently act. I remember they did very much the same thing during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. They started when Iraq attacked Iran in halting all military supplies to Iraq. They strongly disapproved of the Iraqi attack on Iran. They reassured the Iranians that they were opposed to it and that they would not supply the Iraqis with military aid to attack Iran. This despite the fact that the Soviet Union was at that time Iraq's far and away its biggest military supplier. And in fact, what the Russians also arranged during the 1980s, at a time when Iraq appeared for a time to have the advantage in the war, was that they allowed military equipment to reach Iran. And of course, it was provided by Russia's ally and in effect its proxy, the Soviet Union's proxy at that time, which was none other than North Korea, incidentally. And then the Iranians basically were successful in pushing the Iraqis out of their territory, but the leader of Iran at that time, Ayatollah Khamenei, not to be confused with the current Iranian leader, who is Ayatollah Khamenei. Anyway, Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader of Iran's revolution and the founder of the Islamic Republic, he appeared to want to extend the war into Iraq itself. In fact, he spoke about liberating the Shia holy sites inside Iraq. And just as the Russians strongly disapproved of the Iraqi attack on Iran, they also disapproved of the continued Iranian advance into Iraq. So, where they had previously switched off the supply of weapons to Iraq, they then turned it back on again. And one could see how, by turning on and off the arms supply tap to these two countries, the Russians ultimately gained significant leverage over both and were able to use that leverage to edge them towards an eventual ceasefire agreement. I remember this period very well. You can call it cold-blooded and cynical if you choose, and in some respects, of course, it is. But it was very typical of the way the Russians conducted diplomacy then, and I don't think very much has changed now. So the Russians are now backing Iran. They're providing Iran with all kinds of weapons. That gives the Russians leverage over Iran. And of course, it also gives the Russians a certain degree of leverage over Israel, because they know very well how vulnerable Israel is to a prolonged missile war. And they also know that they have the capabilities to make Iranian missile strikes on Israel extremely effective, as was demonstrated on the 1st of October. And the latest reports from the Middle East suggest that the Russians are now working to use that leverage to try to compel ceasefires. Ceasefires in Lebanon, and I am fairly sure, confident before long, ceasefires in Gaza, if, of course, they're able to achieve this. And we've had a very interesting article to this effect from Newsweek. And Newsweek is drawing its information from the Middle East media, but it says that Putin emerges as potential peace broker in the Middle East. Russia is being considered as a potential player in a deal to halt the conflict raging between Israel and the Lebanese Hezbollah movement, leveraging, notice the use of that word, its unique position to prevent an even larger scale war from erupting across a region consumed by crisis for more than a year. And then we're told that Newsweek has learnt about this by tracking reports from Israel's Ynet News and from the Saudi-owned, British-based Asharq al-Awsat, which I presume is either a news agency, Arab news agency, or newspaper. And then, of course, there's an enormous amount of discussion in this article about what the Russians are up to, much of it not really very informative, at least not in my opinion. But we do have comments like this from Orna Mizrahi, a former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor. We always prefer the Americans, but we understand that because of the Russians' really good relations nowadays with the Iranians, maybe they can provide something that will contribute to this for the stability of any arrangement in the future. And then Mizrahi points out that Russia is a member of the permanent member of the Security Council, and that all of these latest developments come at a time when Russia wants to be involved. They want to be relevant to what's going on in the region. Now, I'm going to say straight away that it's entirely plausible that the Russians, who have a marked aversion to instability in the Middle East, this is again a factor which many people in the West find difficult to get their heads around, but it's been a consistent story. The Russians, for example, looked on with deep dismay to the Arab Spring phenomenon of 2011. They saw it as enormously disruptive and essentially part of an American plot to remake the Middle East. They're very worried that chaos in the Middle East will lead to a wider crisis, one which could affect their own southern regions. This is a long-standing and historic concern, and they have always positioned themselves, both during the Soviet period and since the Cold War, as a force for stability in the Middle East. They want to avoid wider wars in this case between Israel and Iran. They want to stabilize the situation in Lebanon and Gaza. And by the way, and it's absolutely consistent with this thinking. In order to achieve long-term stability in the Middle East, they want, and have always argued for, a resolution, a sustained long-term resolution of the crisis between Israel and the Palestinians, with Russia being a consistent supporter of the setting up of a Palestinian state. And the Russians, all the way back in the 1970s, as I well remember, proposed the setting up of a peace conference, an international peace conference, which was intended to lead to a settlement of this conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And I find it most interesting that over the course of the last year, this proposal has suddenly been revived, though the Russians, who have been lending public support to it, have been careful to make it appear that it is the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi who has been the first to come up with it. But anyway, this, as I said, is fully consistent with Russian foreign policy, and before that with Soviet foreign policy in the Middle East. So it is entirely plausible that the Russians are doing what they can at the moment to try to stabilize the situation. And notice that they have leverage, which is again the point that the Israelis are making, that Mr. Mizrahi is making. Because the Russians are now supplying weapons to Iran, and not just weapons, but satellite technology and radar technology and that kind of thing, they're in a position to determine how effective a strike by Iran against Israel might be. And that, as I said, gives the Russians leverage over both sides. Now, none of this means, and I want to stress this, that these negotiations and these discussions, which the Russians are now involved in, are going to work. But I'm going to make a suggestion that with the Russians actually doing what the Americans never do, which is actually applying leverage, they're in a position to make the Israelis sit up. They can say to the Israelis, look, if you won't negotiate and you continue to escalate in the way that you have done, we demonstrated on the 1st of October that Iran can hit you and hit you hard. Maybe your own attack on Iran, by contrast, was not quite as effective as you expected it to be. And yes, we may have had something to do with that. So the Russians have that leverage over the Israelis. And of course, they have leverage over Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran too, because they can say to the Iranians, Hezbollah, and Hamas, yes, we are there. We want you to achieve your long-term objective of a Palestinian state and a stabilization of the situation in the Middle East. But you have to listen to us, because we're the people who make it possible for you to do real damage to Israel over and above, far and away over and above what you have been able to do up to now. So the Russians do have leverage, but of course they're coming up against the fact that both in Israel and in Iran, there is competing demands for escalation, and there's demands for escalation on the part of Hezbollah, within Hezbollah, and obviously within Hamas as well. Nobody should assume that this kind of Russian diplomacy is going to necessarily succeed. In fact, if I had to guess, I would say it probably won't succeed. I think that the momentum towards war is too strong. But at least, according to these reports, which, by the way, I should make clear, I believe are true. They are consistent with the whole pattern of events that we have seen play out up to now, and with certain comments that Putin made at the Kazan BRICS conference when he appeared to speak of Russia being prepared to act, to play a mediating role between Israel and its enemies. So I believe these reports from the Israeli and Saudi media are actually true, and that the Russians really are doing all of the things that we've just been hearing and reading about. Now, I would just make a few further quick points. Firstly, notice how very different the style of Russian diplomatic activity is. When the Americans do things, they do it all publicly, very openly. You have all sorts of people, all sorts of officials. We have currently 2 American officials from the White House, Amos Hochstein and Brett McGurk, 2 extremely hardline figures. They're supposed to be working to achieve a ceasefire with Lebanon as well. They've, in fact, announced or produced a ceasefire package, which I am fairly sure Hezbollah and Iran are going to reject. Anyway, the Americans do everything in full public view. They make all kinds of public statements. Their rhetoric is very noisy and very loud. They publicly deploy THAAD missiles to Israel. The President of the United States visits Israel and ostentatiously hands out blank checks and does things like that. Whereas, again, and this is absolutely typical of Russian diplomatic practice in the Middle East, the Russians prefer to act under a cloak. It's likely that Shoigu has visited Iran many more times than we know, but it's all been done in secret. Again, I can remember how during the 1973 war between the Arab states and Israel, the Soviet Prime Minister at that time, Alexei Kosygin, visited Egypt and was playing all kinds of doing all sorts of important things whilst he was there with the Egyptians, acting again in complete secrecy. As I said, Kissinger was flying around, but Kosygin was also there. And nobody until long after learnt that Kosygin had been there all along. And of course the Russians provide weapons or a technology or something, information to the Iranians. But again, they don't confirm it, they don't talk about it, whereas the Americans ostentatiously send and deploy THAAD launchers to Israel, and their fighter jets are busy in the night skies over the Middle East chasing Iranian missiles. So the 2 superpowers, the Russians and the Americans, in the Middle East conduct their diplomacy in a completely different way. Suffice to say that it is my belief that in this particular situation that we're looking at in the Middle East now, it is the Russian approach that is going to be more effective if a wider war in the Middle East is going to be avoided. But I do want to repeat again, the Russians are swimming here against the tide. I still believe that a momentum towards war is extremely strong, and I doubt that the Russians by themselves can prevent it happening. So that's the first thing. That's the main part of my discussion about the situation in the Middle East now. It's been a bit of history, but I think it does all require some explanation. Now, I want to quickly touch again on the Israeli attack, the Israeli strike on Iran. Because when I last discussed this about 2 programs ago, I discussed what Alistair Crooke, the former British diplomat, had been saying, based on statements coming out from information that he'd been provided by his Iranian sources, which is that the Israeli strike had initially been intended to be far more ambitious, that lots of Israeli aircraft were supposed to be involved in the strike, and of course the Israelis themselves said that there would be 100 aircraft were participating, but that the Israelis were deterred from pressing forward with their strike by the effectiveness of Iran's air defense system, which managed to shoot down at least a proportion of Israel's missiles, limiting the damage done, and also, perhaps even more so, by the fact that Israeli aircraft, F-35 fighter jets, were being tracked by advanced radars, presumably provided to Iran by Russia. So that was the story that I discussed a couple of days ago. Now, I have to say that I've had a deluge of information pouring in over the last couple of days since I made that program, and since I made an earlier program about Ayatollah Khamenei's comments, about which, by the way, I still stand by my own interpretation. I still think it is ultimately a green light to pursue a nuclear deterrent. But that's a discussion for another time. Now, since I made those comments, I've had a lot of people comment about the Israeli strike on Iran, and amongst them was a email I've received from a reliable source with access to information from Russia. And this source says that there's been discussion in the Duma, that could be connected with the Duma's debates about ratifying the Russian-Iranian Strategic Partnership Treaty, that there's been discussion in the Duma about the effectiveness of the Israeli strike, and that the general view there was that the strike was actually quite effective, that a large proportion of Iran's air defense radars were indeed destroyed, and that the Iranians have been pleading with the Russians to provide replacements, which the Russians are doing, but of course can only do up to a certain point. I should say that my understanding is that air defense radars, particularly the very sophisticated air defense radars, are even more difficult to manufacture and supply than the air defense interceptors are. So those are the reports. Now that is contrary to the Alistair Crooke account, and it has to be taken seriously because this is information which comes from a good source and who has obtained this information, or so I am told, from sources inside Russia. Now, I want to repeat again, I don't know the truth of this. If we go back to the defense minister, the Iranian defense minister, General Nasir Zadeh, it's almost as if, however, he seems to be arguing back against precisely the information that the source tells me the Russians are talking about with each other. He says that he goes out of his way to say that Israeli fighter jets failed to penetrate Iranian airspace. He says that only one air defense complex, presumably, as I said, that's the Hawk complex, was destroyed. He says that the damage that was actually done was limited, And no, it is not true that there were successful Israeli drone attacks on Iran launched from Azerbaijan. So it's almost as if the Iranian defense minister is arguing with these discussions that are happening in Russia. Now, as I said, I don't know where the truth is, and I think that's the first thing anybody in this situation needs to say. But I am going to, nonetheless, continue to stick overall with the Alistair Crook view, which is that I can't help but think that if the Israeli attack had been a lot more effective, or as effective as we've been led to think, both by Israeli accounts, or some Israeli accounts, and by these reports that are circulating inside Russia itself, we would be seeing an awful lot more evidence of this. We would be provided by the Israelis with satellite and other photographs showing the destroyed radars and that kind of thing. And the fact that we are not being provided with this information, I think, is indicative that probably it is the Crook account that is the more reliable at the end of the day. I'm going to guess that the Russians, who must surely know what really has happened in Iran, so I would have thought it would be a very unwise and dangerous thing for the Iranian defense minister to try to pull the wool over their eyes, if that's really what he's trying to do. But the Russians, perhaps these discussions that have taken place in the Duma are based on information that is being drawn from the Israeli media, where I do know that some of these claims have appeared. And that would not surprise me, by the way. I don't know how well informed the officials in the Duma actually are about these matters. And it's quite likely that they're trying to piece information together by going to the Israeli media themselves. But I have to mention this, that there is this inconsistency, as I said, and it is coming from Russia. So, keep it in mind. We don't know definitely where the truth is. I lean, as I said, more to the Alistair Crook side of things. But, one shouldn't invest too much in a theory like that. One must wait and see. Over time, maybe we'll get more information and we'll understand better what is actually going on. So to repeat again, the Russians are there. They're in the Middle East. They're talking to Israel. They're talking to Iran. They're doing what they can to broker an agreement. But the fighting in the meantime goes on. The death and destruction goes on. Hezbollah has a new Secretary General, so if the intention was to destroy Hezbollah by assassinating its leaders, it doesn't seem to be working. Hezbollah continues to launch rocket attacks on Israel. The situation overall remains as it had been. And of course, the hardliners, especially I have to say the hardliners in Israel, continue to demand more war. And these strong comments that have been coming from Iran, assuming, of course, that they're not intended, again, to reinforce Iran's position in these ceasefire negotiations, which is possible. These strong voices threatening further attacks from Iran strongly suggest that feelings there are also running very high and that a demand for retaliation against Israel exists there too. So the momentum to war is very strong. I still believe too strong, but the Russians are there and we'll see what they achieve. and what they do. And in the nature of these kind of events, don't be surprised if suddenly, out of nowhere, we get a peace and ceasefire agreement. One that no one expects. I remember that the Russians did exactly the same thing, again, during the Syrian war, when over the course of the siege of Aleppo, it turned out that they'd been negotiating with Turkey, the Turks, with Erdogan, a ceasefire deal for Aleppo and an evacuation of the jihadi fighters there. And suddenly, out of nowhere, the agreement, which no one knew was even being negotiated, was suddenly presented to the Security Council, the UN Security Council, and brought the siege of Aleppo finally to an end. Anyway, that's what I want to say today about the situation in the Middle East. A very complicated business, and as I said, all kinds of things have been discussed in private. We can only perhaps draw a little bit of the curtain to one side, but none of us really knows the full story of what is going on. Let's now turn to the situation in Ukraine. And the first thing I want to say is that there continue to be lots of reports and rumours about what the North Koreans may or may not be doing in Kursk region. I noticed that the number of North Korean troops has now been adjusted down again from, was it 15,000 at one time to 10,000? It's now 8,000. The Ukrainians have announced, or rather have named the 3 North Korean generals who are supposed to be commanding these troops. From what I can tell, they are generals who would be extremely easy to identify simply by going to the North Korean information pages and finding who the commanders of the special forces and the deputy commander of the general staff in North Korea and all of that is. So I don't personally put any weight on that at all. The North Korean foreign minister, who is an extremely able diplomat, by the way, Western officials who have had dealings with her have been very impressed by her. Just to say, anyway, the North Korean foreign minister, as it happens, is currently in Moscow, and she's been making various statements about the special military operation. And we have a report from the from the Russian TASS news agency about this. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un authorized significant assistance to Russia and its people as soon as the special military operation began, without regard to anyone, North Korean Foreign Minister Choi Son-hui stated during talks with Russia's top diplomat Sergei Lavrov. As the special military operation was launched, respected Comrade Kim Jong-un, chairman of State Affairs, instructed us to provide support to the Russian army and the Russian people in their sacred war on a sustainable and powerful basis without regard to anyone. Anyway, that is what Choi Son-hui is saying. She's essentially saying there's absolutely nothing new, nothing has changed. We've been providing various types of support to the Russians ever since 2022. Talking about verbal and diplomatic support, that has been absolutely the case. And she went on to say that we would like to reaffirm our reassurances that we will always stand firm by our Russian comrades until victory. Now, this is all very typical, by the way, of North Korean political rhetoric. And given that the Russians do want to forge a closer relationship with North Korea, I can easily imagine that the Russians are both inconvenienced by it in some ways, but don't want to publicly contradict these statements of support by, for example, giving two strong contradictions. But to repeat again, both the North Korean and Russian foreign ministries up to now have been saying that there is no plan for North Korean troops to participate in the fighting in the Kursk region. They're not denying that there are North Koreans in Russia, but they're not saying what they're doing there. But the reports that I've seen are consistent with a training mission. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about that. What I will say is that, of course, the Americans, again, are playing up this story, and so are the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians now, we're told, are coming to South Korea and are demanding that South Korea provide all kinds of weapons in response to the North Korean deployments or alleged deployments in Russia in the area of the special military operation or in Kursk region. And I have said in various programs that I have some knowledge of South Korea, and I've said that any South Korean decision, any decision by the South Korean government to provide military support to Ukraine would be extremely unpopular in South Korea. And I was very interested to see that there has been a long article in the Financial Times confirming as much. We read that the prospect of directly supplying arms to Ukraine has been fiercely opposed by South Korea's left-wing opposition, which holds a majority in parliament and which blames the South Korean government's hardline stance towards North Korea for pushing North Korea into Moscow's embrace. Arming Ukraine is an incredibly dangerous idea that treats people's lives like pawns in a chess game. Park Chan-dae, floor leader of the Democratic Party, that's the South Korean opposition party, told a party rally last week, arguing South Korea had no direct interest in the outcome of the war. President Yoon, that's the South Korean president, shouldn't engage South Korea in a proxy war with North Korea in a faraway land. Deepening Seoul's involvement would risk starting a military conflict on the Korean peninsula. And the Financial Times then tells us a little more about the mood in South Korea, about the idea of military aid, and it turns out that 66% of South Koreans are strongly opposed to their country providing lethal aid to Ukraine, and surprise, surprise, only 13% of South Koreans would support that idea. So there would be very, very strong opposition in South Korea, and the South Korean parliament would be strongly opposed as well. Now, there are apparently restrictions on doing this in terms of South Korean law and South Korea's constitution. There are suggestions that the very hardline, very pro-American president of South Korea, President Yoon, might be seeking ways to bypass the South Korean parliament. I think were that to happen, there would be even more opposition in South Korea. And I have to say that I think there's a fair chance that the current government in South Korea, which is actually deeply unpopular already, might not survive this whole venture if that's the route it eventually elects to go down on. Certainly South Korea could in theory supply a significant amount of weaponry to Ukraine, though again doing so would take a fair amount of time, and of course it could provoke Russian responses and North Korean responses, and also responses from China. And the North Koreans have pointedly just tested one of their intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Hwasong-19, and exactly as the South Korean opposition is saying, getting involved in a proxy war in Ukraine, of all places, against North Korea, risks intensifying the already very fraught situation in the Korean Peninsula as well. And I suspect that ultimately, if these plans for intervention in Ukraine do exist, and as I say, knowing a little bit about South Korea, I am skeptical that will happen to anything like the degree that some people think. And by the way, and for the record, I strongly doubt that South Korea anyway has the resources, despite its acknowledged manufacturing prowess, to make the difference in the war that some people think it does. Now, all of that should then lead us to the situation, a consideration of the overall situation on the battlefronts. But before I do that, let me quickly say that there has been a superb article, a superb analysis of the war and of the way it's playing out by the blogger whom I know as Big Serge. He's written on his Substack piece. It's a long article, The Forest and the Trees, Ukraine's Strategic Dissipation. And Big Serge makes the absolutely correct point, made by many others, by the way. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, as I said, made the same point all the way back in 2022, which is that, yes, Ukraine can occasionally achieve tactical successes in one place or another, or has been able to do so over the course of this war. But it has never come up with a strategy for victory which does not ultimately require the involvement of outside parties. And this is absolutely true. Ukrainian battlefield actions have been entirely tactics. There has been no overall, all-encompassing military strategy such as could conceivably achieve a victory over Russia. I would argue that given the enormous lopsided advantage that Russia has, that is actually impossible. But anyway, it's a fine article and it repays good reading. Talking about the situation in Ukraine, it does, however, bring me to an interesting article that has now appeared in Bloomberg. Russia speeds up advance in Ukraine as mood darkens in Kiev. And we learn that the Russian army is gaining speed in its advance in eastern Ukraine. Now, I've been saying this for ages, by the way, that since at least the spring, that the momentum, the speed of the Russian advance has been steadily climbing month after month. I believe October witnessed the largest Russian advance in terms of territory that we have seen in the whole period of the special military operation, save for that brief and untypical period at the very start of the conflict in February and March 2022. In fact, we learned that from Bloomberg that Russia has captured 1,146 square kilometers in Ukraine since August 6th, and that it has added another 200 square kilometers in just the last few weeks. In fact, I believe it is the last week, just to say. And the article that speaks about the fact that this growing mood of, demoralization across Ukraine, that the Ukrainian public now increasingly longs for peace. They understand that the war is unwinnable, but nonetheless the demand to keep fighting from President Zelensky continues, even as the Russians steadily grind on. And the article also talks about the nervousness that some in Kiev have about the prospects of the American election next week and what might happen afterwards. And this same doubt or worry has also been reflected in the United States by none other than Robert Gates. Robert Gates, as I well remember, was previously George W. Bush's defense secretary, and he was also CIA director for a time, and he also served Obama, and he has now openly criticized Ukraine's Kursk operation. He said, I would just say that about this incursion into Russia, the Kursk incursion, my personal view is that it was a strategic mistake. That's 30,000 very good Ukrainian troops that I think should have been used to strengthen the front in Donbass, where they are under huge pressure, and the Russians are very slowly moving forward, taking one village at a time. And he said this at a meeting of the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. And he apparently then went on to say, and this is interesting coming from a former CIA director, that Russia is capable of continuing its special military operation in Ukraine until it decides that its goals are met. In other words, until Putin is satisfied that the objectives that he set out at the start of the special military operation, denuclearization, demilitarization, neutral status for Ukraine, all of those things are met. And Gates then went on to say that the West has significantly underestimated Russia, and it probably has to do with not reading enough Russian history. It's got a lot more to do, and a lot more than that. I mean, examining the Russian industrial base, for example, might have been a good idea. Getting a sense of its scientific skills and its technology base too might have been a good idea also. As a former CIA director, he should know all about that. But anyway, must be grateful, I suppose, for these important admissions. Now, all of that leads us to looking at what's going on the front lines. And in fact, the front lines in Ukraine continue to crumble, and they continue to crumble very, very fast. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has just confirmed that Shakhtarska and Novoukrainka, these two villages north of Ugledar, have now fallen, that the Russians are in complete control of them. So the Russians control all of the three villages north of Ugledar, Novoukrainka, Shakhtarska, and Bogoyavlenka. They've also captured Katerinovka in this area, and they've also captured the village of Yasnaya Polyana. They are moving north. Most people think that they're moving towards the village of Constantinople. They've entered Kurakovo. It looks as if they are, as I've discussed in many programs now, working to create a cauldron around the Ukrainian troops in Kurakovo. And north of Kurakovo, north of the Kurakovo reservoir, the pocket, the place where those Ukrainian troops were holding out in that small town, Gornyak, if you prefer, and in the villages of Kurakovka, Izmailovka, Zoryanye, Vovchenka. That pocket appears to have, as I said, completely collapsed. There are, in fact, reports this morning that the last village in this pocket, Vovchenka, has now fallen. What has happened to all of these Ukrainian troops who were garrisoning these villages is an open question. Radovka the other day suggested that they have fled to Kurakovo itself. I'm not sure how they could have got there. The Russians control the village of Ostrivska, which lies in the way towards Kurakovo. If these Ukrainian troops were fleeing from these villages overland, Perhaps they moved westwards and then have been transported to Kurakovo by boat across the reservoir. I mean, I just don't know. But anyway, one way or the other, there's been a complete collapse, it seems, of Ukrainian resistance in this pocket. And the Russians continue to push steadily westwards. There are reports that the Russians from Selidovo further north are now advancing along the railways. Apparently the Russians like to advance along railways. I remember reading an explanation of why this was so some time ago, that the railway lines are difficult to mine and that they provide all kinds of forms of protection and that they are a good route that enables obstacles to be crossed without too much obstruction. But anyway, the Russian troops from Selidovo are now advancing along the railway lines. They're advancing along the railway lines towards Andreevka and Constantinople from the north, even as the Russians seem to be preparing to advance on those villages from the south. And the reports say that the Russians are also advancing from Selidovo along the railway lines towards Pokrovsk. Now, the purpose here would be not so much, I think, to attack Pokrovsk itself from the south, but to start to cut off the supply lines to Pokrovsk from the west. The Russians have already done damage to the road and railway bridges in this area, but presumably the Ukrainians can repair them. And anyway, the Russians, moving along the railway lines, are aiming, it would seem, to cut off Pokrovsk completely. So this big battle, this great battle from Ugledar all the way up to Pokrovsk, is heading remorselessly towards its culmination, its culminating point. The Russians have already broken into Kurakovo, and there is already fighting going on there. They control Novogrodivka and Selidovo, and they also control the smaller towns of Ukrainsk and, well, let's call it Gornyak. They've captured most of the villages, both north and south of the reservoir, and they have also captured Ugledar. Their air force is active all the time. Fab bombs fall regularly on the Ukrainian soldiers. Ukrainian air defenses have ceased to function, and Russian drones are there constantly above the battlefields. So this battle is moving fast towards its culmination, which will be the Battle of Pokrovsk, which will start to happen, I'm guessing, sometime in November. Now, further west, we have now also received from the Russian Defense Ministry more news about the situation in the Toretsk area. The Russian Defense Ministry has said that a village called Leonodivka, which is located to the west of Toretsk, has also been captured by the Russian army. Now, this is one of those villages which the Russians, it's located just north of Nelipivka. I suspect that it was the primary Russian objective over the last 2 weeks. We haven't been hearing much about this. If you look at where its location, just to the west of Toretsk, and by the way, of the Zabalka micro-district that we've been hearing so much about. What the Russians, again, are doing is they're edging northwards along these villages and the roads and railway lines, and it's clear that they're working towards an eventual cut-off of the situation in Toretsk. There appears to have been some kind of alarm or panic, brief panic, in Ukraine over the last couple of hours about the situation in Toretsk, and by the way, also Chasiv Yar, because the Ukrainian military command has been forced over the course of today to publish denials that Toretsk and Chasiv Yar have fallen. They obviously haven't. There are reports that the Russians are continuing to advance in both of these towns. But these reports, which may, by the way, originate from some kind of Russian propaganda operation, I mean, it's not impossible, that sort of thing happens, were apparently gaining some traction and were creating nervousness in Ukraine, and there was some need, apparently, or at least the Ukrainian authorities felt that there was some need to reject these claims. Anyway, that's the situation in Toretsk. In Chasiv Yar, by the way, there are lots of reports now showing Russian troops continuing their advance from the southern areas of Chasiv Yar, gradually cutting off the roads and the railway lines leading into Chasiv Yar. And there's been reports also that the Russians have now taken more ground along the Oskol and Zherebets river lines. I suspect that it's now just some weeks before the Russians are in complete control of the east banks of both of these rivers, enabling the Russians to launch their offensive from that direction too. And Group of Forces North continues to claim that it's advancing in Kursk region. It claimed a further advance of 2 kilometers, I'm not sure where. There are reports that the Russians have captured a forest belt, which would mean that some Ukrainian troops to the north of it are cut off. But the reports are very, very vague and difficult to fathom. But anyway, suffice to say, the direction of the war continues. The Russian advance continues to be very fast. Ukraine, a demoralized country, and as I discussed at length in my program yesterday, the political leadership in Kiev becoming increasingly disconnected from reality, refusing to contemplate withdrawals in any of the obvious places, as Big Serge says, with no real plan or strategy for victory. All they seem to know how to do, or actually do, is try desperately to float ideas like the idea for talks on a cessation of attacks on the energy system, which, as I pointed out yesterday, the Russians are saying are untrue, and also looking for some way that they can, whatever way they can, to get the Western powers involved, with the story of the North Korean soldiers being plugged and pushed to do that as far as it can take, and threatening now to create a political crisis in South Korea as well. Well, that's my program for today. We will see whether these negotiations in the Middle East lead anywhere. I don't think they will. But by the way, even if they don't, the fact that the Russians are involved again in the Middle East at this level is an important fact which may have consequences in the future. Anyway, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget also to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel if you've liked this video. As I said, that's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.